My name is Ian Peterson, new to Nebraska Extension, but happy to be here and new to GroBigRed. Very happy to be here and happy to talk to you today about growing vegetables. And in particular, getting as much as you can out of whatever size space that you've got available. So, David, do you want to just introduce yourself before we get rolling in?
Sure. I'm David Lott. I'm the horticulture educator based in North Platte, and I have the 16 counties in west central Nebraska, from Cherry County straight through the Sandhills down to the Kansas and Colorado borders. So I do quite a bit of work with vegetable gardening and working with the produce team.
I suppose I should say too, I'm based out of Fremont in Dodge County, and I'm the horticulture educator for 10 counties, pretty much the northeast corner of the state, plus Saunders County. So without further ado, let's get rolling. Is that on?
Yes.
Okay. So we are here to talk about maximizing your garden space. Now, I know that a number of people will have anxiety kind of rolling up the back of their neck looking at this picture. But this was a very successful garden. This is my home garden with my family. That's our son down in the corner there, and we're happy to have him and our daughter growing up, learning how to garden, and just kind of making our own food and making our own way that way. So what we want to talk to you about today are some strategies. We aren't here to tell you exactly how to garden necessarily. We know that everybody is coming with their own levels of experience. We're here to help you, not to shame you, say you're doing anything wrong, but really just to provide extra strategies, new ideas, things that you might not have considered before. So we're going to talk about vertical gardening strategies, some that you have probably heard of and use every year, and some that you might never have thought of. Intercropping strategies, sort of following that, getting the most out of what your space looks like. Cover crops, which is something that's becoming a little bit more common in home gardens. Some strategies there to help your soil, help your plants, help you grow a better garden a little bit more easily. And then David's going to jump in and talk about succession planting. So we are going to team up again in September, I believe it is, to talk about fall gardening and gardening strategies. But that's a little bit late here in Nebraska to start your crops. So we'll talk about what to think about once we get towards the end of the summer growing season. And then just for overall considerations, irrigation strategies so that your plants can be as healthy and happy as possible. There's a lot of benefits to growing upwards. The number one is space. So there's a lot of plants that spread out, and there's a lot of plants that just kind of fill in along the ground. If we can figure out a way to get those growing upwards, then we have a little bit more square footage around the base of those plants to put in a few more plants, a few more flowers, kind of whatever you feel like putting down there. Definitely a disease consideration for growing vertically. Basically, if you think about when you see mushrooms pop up in the yard or in the garden, it's usually after a rain or after you water pretty heavy. Bacteria, fungi, and other things really like that moisture. And so if we can get things growing upward, it gives a little bit more airflow. And so that prevents them from, or it decreases the likelihood that they'll grow. It kind of creates a not very happy environment for them. A lot of the diseases that affect our garden plants come from the soil. Oh, am I still here?
You are. Your picture froze,
Okay.
but you're here.
Okay, bad internet. It told me that Zoom quit. Sorry. A lot of the bacteria and fungi that are affecting our plants are actually coming from the soil up. So they can definitely infect down in the roots, but there's also a lot that happens when we get a rain or if we're doing overhead watering, splashing up to the leaves. So if we can prevent that as much as possible, then we can prevent the spread of disease. And then just ease of harvesting. You're not going to have to bend over to harvest as much. And then there's actually, as we'll see a little bit with tomatoes specifically, there's some ways that if you can prune a little bit more effectively, and certainly being able to take care of some of those older leaves and pruning out disease early, being able to see it, you're going to have more vigorous growth on your plants and typically at least a little bit better harvest, better yield. So starting with one of those strategies that we're all quite familiar with, staking. It's something that you can put next to just about any plant. You do want to consider how big that plant is going to get. Plant or stake at planting, just because it's really teeny tiny next to a really big stake does not mean that you need to start small, because if you're pulling that stake out, putting in a new one, you can damage the roots. So plan to stake for the final size of that plant. 3 to 4 feet for things like peppers, eggplant, that kind of stuff. 4 to 5 feet for the determinate tomatoes, and then 5 foot plus. And that's where we'll get into different types of caging and trellising strategies for those indeterminate tomatoes and vining plants. A lot of different materials available for staking plants. Make sure that they go on fairly loose. You want your plants to be able to move a little bit, because if they're held too straight, then you can get a snap in a wind. You also don't want to girdle the stem as it's growing up. So you want to leave enough room for the plant to grow and flex around in the wind to be nice and strong. There are some plastic wrapped or rubber wrapped metal, kind of like twist ties. There is plant tying ribbon that's pretty common in the horticulture industry. And then one that's actually really handy, especially if you're growing up like a fence or something like that. You can use little round clips. Those are used a lot in hydroponic tomato production, but they are very handy. Match the material to what you are growing. So if you've got something that's a little bit shorter, you can use something that's a little bit smaller, something like a bamboo stake. But if you've got a big tomato going up a stake, you might want to consider something that's more of a metal post, rebar, PVC. Those are solid materials that are going to maintain their integrity once the plant is tall, and if you have a 6 or 7 foot post. You can consider tying a number of posts together at the top and form that pyramidal shape that can have a number of different plants vining up. You can also use that as kind of a shaded area to grow underneath, a little bit more cool season crops that aren't going to like that heat as much. It prevents the drying out, the drying hot winds, and definitely the more direct sun. So we'll talk a little bit more about that with the idea of intercropping later. And then with multiple stakes, you can actually do what's called the Florida weave sometimes. And so you take string and you weave in and out of the different sides of the stakes, and then that creates a little loop area that you can pull open and feed your plant through as it's growing up. Every 8 or 10 inches is going to be the most sturdy for those plants. Very common with tomatoes. Another one we're familiar with is caging, but there's a number of ways that we can use cages that aren't just for those taller plants. So a lot of different types, a lot of different styles. We know that there's no reason that stores should still be selling those 3-prong, really flimsy, small ones. They always break after a couple seasons, get that rust going on, but they might still have their place in the garden. Some smaller plants that we might not have thought about caging include something like broccoli, zucchini, eggplants, where we can sort of train them upwards, but really helping us think about pruning off that lower foliage so that we can prevent disease and give a little bit more open environment, certainly making it easier to scout for pests and that kind of thing. Summer squashes can actually be trained a little bit more vertically in that sense as well. So just something to consider. Keeping it more contained vertically gives you more space around the plant. You can use a cage to grow multiple vining plants, peas, beans, that kind of thing up the outside. If you do just a few, then you can do that around another plant, say putting your peas up the cage before you have full growth of that tomato. And so you're harvesting those peas before the tomato is really getting going off. Just be careful. I know from experience that putting 8 or 10 bean plants around a tomato cage, you don't end up with a tomato, you end up with just beans. As delicious as they are, you don't get your tomatoes. Trellising is potentially a little bit intimidating strategy just because there are so many different ways to approach it. But you can have a really good trellis with very simple materials. You can make a portable trellis that you pull down and store at the end of every year. You can make a permanent trellis, and just any number of ways to just guide those plants up. So they're good for vining crops, whole beans, peas, cucumbers, and any number of our squashes, something like Malabar spinach, a heat-tolerant green that tastes like spinach, even though it's not directly related to it. Indeterminate tomatoes are a really good option for trellising just because they grow for basically the whole season. And once they start to fruit, they don't stop. And so if you trellis them upward, pruning to just a few main shoots that you're going to really focus on that fruit production, those fruit producing stems, you get a really good plant growing off of that. We don't always think about it, but some of our vining squashes that we just let take over the ground are actually really good candidates for trellising. You can see I've got a couple of pictures there of a cattle guard tunnel that's covered in birdhouse gourds. And I love that picture in the bottom right where I found a bird had built a nest right next to a birdhouse gourd. So it's pretty fun. And then the two pictures on top are cucumbers that are growing up a trellis. And like I said, trellises can be just about anything. That is 2 2x4s with some garden fencing that I just stapled up the length of the 2x4s. And it was previously in a pot, and then we took it out of the pot and just screwed it to the garden fence. So really simple, really easy, and that has actually been around from pot to now still, almost 10 years. So very simple materials, relatively easy to source, and they can last a really long time. Make sure that you are thinning that foliage. I know that the squash isn't really a good example of that, but if you can keep up with the squash, you're welcome to come over to my house anytime. You can plan for succession. So peas can grow up a trellis, and then you can start your cucumbers down at the bottom while they're growing. And then you can plan to follow that up with beans because the cucumbers are going to slow down a little bit in the summer heat, which is a great time to be growing your beans. And then, as David will talk about a little bit later, planning for that July succession. Just some more pictures from our home garden. We've been trying a lot of different strategies these last couple of years. So cattle panels, those big posts, they're 8-foot posts that we got at the local garden hardware store. They were $8 for an 8-foot post, so pretty handy even if you're just staking. Not too expensive to try a new strategy, but if you throw some fencing on there, some cattle guard, you can have a really fantastic crop. So those are our San Marzano tomatoes that we grew last year that turned out really, really well. And those were, I want to say, by the time the posts were put into the ground and the fence put on, they were about 7-8 foot tall. So that's a lot of tomatoes. We have our swing set there. You can use whatever you have available. You don't necessarily have to build a trellis or buy the materials. So if there's something that's vertical, you can pretty much grow on it. Just be careful because your son or daughter might get upset that you've now moved the garden into their play area. But when they're eating the tomatoes, they don't mind so much. The picture on the left is for raspberries that I put together last year. So using the yard fence for stability, and then building something up that I ran wires through to support that vertical growth of the raspberries. If you're willing to get on a 10, 20-foot ladder and nail things into the side of your house, putting up some strings is great for growing any kind of vining plant. Now, I know that those of us who are familiar with fire-safe landscaping might not have too good of thoughts about that one, but it works out. We got a lot of hops that just, they're a specific tea variety and they are fantastic. That 2x4 trellis that I was talking about earlier is also pictured here with some beans growing up. So rotating those crops each year and just using what you've got. Another way to sort of combine intercropping and vertical gardening is with the three sisters strategy. So you grow one plant and grow another one next to it. And the tradition of the three sisters was kind of originated or popularized. The main group that we know that was doing it was the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee up in northeastern United States and southeastern Canada. And the main idea here is that the three sisters, the three plants, and in their cultural tradition, the sisters of the story, are supporting one another, and they are stronger together. They're better together than they would be just by themselves. And then one of the really important aspects why they did this is that it provides a mostly complete diet that they can rely on in addition to some of their other gardening and hunting and gathering strategies that can be relied on year-round, because our winter squash can store for quite a long time, and then you can dry your corn, dry your beans, and use them for long periods of time. So the corn grows tall, supporting that bean that can vine up, and then just nutritionally, it provides carbohydrates for energy. It can be cooked fresh, or it can be milled for flour. The beans have the bacterial relationship, forming those nodules in the soil that are going to convert nitrogen into the plant usable form, which can feed the other plants, the other sisters, mostly once it has finished growing, so sort of helping prepare the soil. But one other interesting aspect is that as that corn grows up, some of us who've grown corn know that once we get into July and August, those winds start pushing and the corn has a tendency to fall over, but the beans can actually help stabilize with those vines being anchored into the ground and wrapped around the plant. They're a really good source of protein and fibers and minerals for the diet aspects. And then squash has large leaves that cover the ground, so that will help suppress weeds because they have less sunlight to grow. It keeps that soil cool and moist, so that's a little bit less work on our side of things to help keep those plants happy. And then the squash itself, providing additional vitamins, minerals, other nutrients, high in fiber, that kind of thing, to the diet. And then one interesting thing, we always hear about corn, beans, and squash, but other culturally important plants such as sunflowers and amaranth, also very important, or at least very useful in a diet, can also be used in place of or in addition to corn. So how do we do the three sisters? I know there's a ton of information on this, but you can go check the recording if you forget some of the really fine-grained details. So this is traditionally planted in mounds. So thinking of your family, the size, your space, however many mounds you think you might need, about 5 to 7 corn seeds per mound, about 8 inches tall and about a foot diameter, and putting those mounds about 3 feet apart just to give enough space, airflow, disease consideration, workability, that kind of thing. Corn gets planted ideally mid-May to early June for us here in Nebraska. You can go to the Crop Watch website to check for the 4-inch depth soil temperature. That's posted daily and updated daily, so just be watching that. I know that we've had some warm weather, but the soil is not quite warm enough to start planting a lot of different things. Most corn varieties are going to be useful for this strategy, except for popcorn. Popcorn varieties tend to only get about 4 to 5 feet tall, but the ornamentals, the drying, milling corns, and the sweet corns can all get tall enough to support a good bean crop and not get overwhelmed. And then just make sure that you're checking the harvest timing for when to plan it, when to plan to harvest it, in terms of all of those crops. And certainly you can succession those and plant some more after you've already got your initial crop going. Once the corn is about 6 inches tall, throw in 4 to 5 beans around the outside of the mound so that the beans can start growing and climbing up. Again, we don't want too many beans to overwhelm the plant. And then that squash can be planted at that same time. So think about how much squash you are actually going to eat. Sometimes we get a little overzealous, but for most families, even some of the biggest families, maybe only 3 to 4, maybe 5 squash plants are necessary. When you're talking about a big grid system, the common strategy is to go 1 every 7 mounds. And so if we have just a few mounds, maybe just 1 squash plant will do. You can use summer or winter varieties, but the vining, the winter varieties will cover a little bit more ground, last a little bit longer than those summer squash varieties. And then make sure that they are not trying to do what the beans are doing. Squash vines are very friendly, and they will definitely try and get to know that corn plant, but we want to make sure that that corn plant stays nice and healthy. So, intercropping or companion planting. So definitely we hear about, we read about, we learn about, we research companion planting and what's good with what. Companion planting is pretty much just a common term for intercropping. Intercropping is an extremely important strategy, but companion planting itself is full of anecdotal evidence, and there's very few controlled studies on specifically what goes well with what, and especially and very significantly why. We are, after all, scientists, and so we do always seek out the why, as troubling as that can be for some people. We can actually pull some logic from the ideas of the companion planting cure-all ideas. So that's just kind of following the idea of intercropping. So we have a bunch of different plants next to each other that can confuse pest insects. If you take similar families of plants, your cabbages, basically your brassica families, and spread them out, then there's not going to be as much potential for massing of any one pest. And that goes for all of our plants. And like I was saying earlier, with planting something like a cool season underneath a warm season crop, you can plant in that shade, especially if you have a good vertical system going for you. And then there are actually plants that prepare the soil for other plants if you're doing something like succession. And so that's what we'll cover when we get to cover crops. So there are definitely some good strategies, but we do need to remember there's not a lot of scientific evidence to guide these specific strategies or our explanations. We can say from our experiences, well, this does this. But we have to really, if we're going to do this regularly, we need to have that specific evidence of the why, the mechanism. So just looking up different things about companion planting, I came across a website that had all of these different pairings, plant this by this and this not by this. And so here's an example of it's great anecdotal evidence from experience, but there's no real scientific or specific evidence of why in terms of sunflowers help keep pests away from the brassicas. Well, what's going on here? We will dig into a little bit about why that might have been, but just saying it doesn't necessarily make it so. It doesn't necessarily mean sunflowers are the only ones that can do this. It's just looking a little bit deeper into those explanations. It could just be a matter of timing. So there are some plants that release those beneficial nutrients, like the beans release the nitrogen when they break down, using something like cover crops and leaving that as a mulch and allowing it to break down can release some compounds, some chemicals, some nutrients that actually help other plants grow. But having them growing right next to each other at the same time, it might not provide that specific benefit. There are some studies, there are some controlled studies that have been done with companion planting. And there was one that found that aromatic plants, so we say, well, plant your lavender, plant your rosemary here to distract the pests. It turned out that green foliage in that study, so similar colors, was more distracting to insects, was more likely to create that culture barrier, if you will, so that it couldn't specifically target a particular plant that it was looking for, its particular host. It had too much to sort through visually. So it wasn't necessarily deterred by those aromatic smells. We might like them, certainly, but it might not have that much of an effect. One thing that I kind of found interesting was that it might actually be a better idea to consider the non-friends in companion planting. So there's a lot of plant this with this, but there's also a lot of, well, this doesn't like this. So you need to think about the types of plants that you're putting next to each other. You might have a really thirsty or a really hungry plant, and so it might not be a good idea to put something that, or two hungry plants or two thirsty plants next to each other, because they're going to have to compete, and then you're going to get stunted growth. So it's not that anything is helping, it's that they're actually hurting. You can pull in, if you have a pest attractive crop, sometimes we use those trap crops. But if you have too many in one place, then that can actually bring in more than you were expecting, and create more of a problem than you were actually trying to prevent. There are some that can just be more susceptible to fungal or bacterial infections, especially, we like to grow with our heirlooms sometimes, and those might be a little bit more susceptible to some of these things, the tomato blights. And that can just, again, invite more problems than you were originally planning for. And then things growing on top of or out competing, out shading other plants. Thinking about if we're doing our brassicas with our broccolis and cauliflowers and such, those have those really big leaves that are spreading out. So if you have too many things packed close together, they're not going to do as well. So it's important to remember there are some very good things about intercropping, but companion planting and gardening is nothing magical, even though it's very, very special and fun. These are plants that we're talking about. They're not people. So I did pick on that same person's website again, because I just couldn't help it when I saw radishes just don't like brassicas. What a shame. So what are some good strategies and ideas for companion planting? Well, one is just to add a little bit more fun to your garden. So adding herbs, teas, tea plants, flowers, different kinds of things like that. They add texture visually so that it's fun to just look outside and check on things. Different colors. You can have flowering plants that you use to bring pollinators and beneficial insects and predatory organisms, if you will, to your garden. So herbs, we rely mostly on the foliage, but we can let them flower. They're not going to be as flavorful and dense with those compounds if they start to flower, but they can still be beneficial in that way. You can, like I said, try new and fun and interesting plants. So throw some tarragon in there. That's a really nice one. Nasturtiums are all the rage, and you can eat those. And calendula is a fun one that we like to grow because it seeds itself out quite readily, and it attracts really good pollinators. It does actually have some antimicrobial compounds, and just it makes a delicious tea in general. So think about just opening the seed catalog and finding something new to grow. I did find a couple of other controlled studies that actually shows that basil does help tomatoes grow. So we always hear about put basil next to your tomatoes and it'll make it taste great and it'll be wonderful. And yeah, that's a really great idea. But how true is that in terms of the evidence? Well, it turns out that if you just grow a tomato in a pot versus growing a tomato with something like basil or even a mint or an anise hyssop, something in the mint family, that in one study, it showed that it created more secondary compounds in the plant itself. So it's not necessarily adding nutrients to us, but at the same time, when we have happier, healthier, stronger plants, you get more fruit, you get better tasting fruit. It's not struggling to make that. And so it might actually make tastier tomatoes because it's growing better. Your plant is happier. And then in another study, there was just more biomass to the plant. So it actually grew a bigger plant. Again, if they didn't look at the mechanism, but in a controlled study of this pot versus that pot, they got bigger plants, more fruit, just more goodness out of that than just growing the plant by itself. I was talking about it a little bit. Planting flowers. We like to have our vegetable gardens for our foods, but adding a little bit of flowering stuff definitely helps. It brings in those pollinators, beneficial insects, predatory animals like our arthropods and our arachnids, and just help make a better ecosystem for everything growing together. So with pollinators, some things might say that they are self-fertile, but everything usually does a little bit better when they get pollinated, especially if you were following Backyard Farmer last year, hearing about the heat stress on the plants affecting the viability of the pollen. When we have those cooler temperatures, if those plants are getting more pollinated, then they are going to have better fruit set, better fruit in general. Our native pollinators are actually more active in the early morning time and in the later evening time than something like honeybees. And so before it gets too hot, we can actually have a little bit more pollination activity happening. Bumblebees are a really good example of something that can pollinate tomatoes, peas, peppers, beans well, because they have this technique that's called sonication. They actually detach their flight muscles from their wings and they vibrate and it brings that pollen out. So that's kind of a neat technique. There are some other bees that can do that, but we definitely know the bumblebees are doing that for our food crops. Squash bees are called such because guess what? They visit squash and our other cucurbit friends. And they're very specific to that. And you can have multiple males waiting inside of flowers for females. And so that is a lot of pollination going on if you have multiple bees per flower and then moving around from flower to flower. And then our other native bees that are going to be nesting in the ground, but still flying around looking for that food, that pollen food source, that nectar, and other really good stuff. Beneficial insects and others, just because it's not just the six-legged friends that are helping us out. But again, you're creating that ecosystem, a place that they can hide for predation on some of those pest insects, and they can get some of their nutrition from the nectar and just different parts of the life cycle too are important to think about, because if you look in the bottom corner there, that ladybug or lady beetle, if you will, and its larvae are actually both really good predators of aphids. And so having a place that they can have eggs hatch, larvae grow, turn into the adult form, that's an entire life cycle of help taking care of pests. So it's just a really good way to bring a lot of things in, a lot of life and interest into the garden and the landscape. Sometimes things freak people out. Personally, I love our Virginia mountain mint plant because it gets covered in these black wasps every year that are an inch and a half long that probably terrifies most people. But it's great. Just seeing that much activity on a plant like that, and knowing that those are doing a really good job for the garden is fantastic to see. So just something to consider. It's not just all about those food crops, but also having some perennial plants, even some annual plants that can bring in pollinators and beneficial insects. So I'll end, I believe, with cover crops. So this is something that just any unused space or even filling in a little bit, as I'll talk about briefly with living mulch, helps our soil, helps our ecosystem. Again, creating that area for beneficials to live in, but also there are cover crops, there are plants that provide nutrients to the soil. Depending on how you terminate, the best way is for just cutting them and leaving that foliage. They break down, they provide a mulch, they keep the soil moist, they suppress weeds. Just there's a lot of good things that come from it. And when we've traditionally thought about our vegetable gardening, that's not something that comes up a lot. And so there are definitely some places to look around for cover crop seed. It does tend to go towards larger scale agriculture, but there are plenty of resources that have seed available in sizes for the homeowner. So yeah, like I said, similar benefits to the companion planting, adding to the soil health, suppressing the weeds. Um, so the methods to do it with the home garden is right now, go and if you have access to getting some cover crop seed, then you can put it down now, have it grow, and it'll help suppress those early weeds. And then when you cut it or mow it down, it provides that mulch for before you start planting. Once you harvest a crop, if you're taking out the whole plant, you're not coming back to that area, put some cover crops down just to cover that soil to prevent weed growth and to keep it just the soil ecology, the soil microbes in that environment in good condition so that it's not drying out, getting too hot, filled with weeds, that kind of thing. And then you can do this after you harvest in the fall. So in September, October, once you're starting to clean out your garden, you can cut these, or you can sow some cover crops. They'll grow, stand over the winter. They'll create a habitat for pollinators and other beneficial organisms, and your garden will be mostly ready to go come spring. Some plants you can plant within and have them be a living mulch. There is a bit of a trade-off there because they are going to be competing for some similar resources. But depending on how you approach it, and if you consider a slight decrease in yield, there's a benefit. There can be a benefit. So it's just a matter of your preference and what you want to do with your garden. There are a few local Nebraska resources for getting cover crop seed, stock seed, green cover, green acres. And there are plenty of other options out there as well. It's worth checking your whatever seed company, seed catalog that you get, checking their catalog or their website to see if they have something with cover crops. So just some quick ideas. I am biased. I absolutely love to experiment with different greens. If someone ever tells you that they don't like salad because it's boring, that means they are just saying that lettuce is boring. There are plenty of other green options that have wonderful tastes between Asian greens and mustard greens and all kinds of different things. So we like to, if we have some open space, we'll throw some green seeds down and they'll just cover the ground. And that's the cool season. And then we can harvest those, have some tasty salads right before we plant our warm season crops. Things like oats and cereal rye fill in really quickly. They have good fibrous roots that are going to hold the soil together, and they fill in to suppress those weeds. Mustard greens and radishes have good tap roots that are going to loosen up if you have compacted soil, if you've been trying for years to amend your garden soil because it just keeps getting too hard. Consider something like that. And again, with something like mustard greens, you can eat those. So plenty of different options there. Buckwheat's a really common one just because it fills in quickly and it's a really good pollinator attractor. Things in the legume family, again, things that you can eat can be used as cover crops. So taking a bush bean and using it as a cover crop. Last year, we mixed bush beans and carrots after we harvested our garlic, threw it down, and it was a cover crop. And then we had tons of beans to harvest once they were done growing. So it was a fantastic strategy for our home. And now I'm going to turn it over to David.
Okay. Thank you, Ian, because a lot of these things we're going to mesh together. And so I have some pictures to show you on succession planting. So when we think about succession planting, it is utilizing that space as efficiently as we possibly can and putting some of those combinations together. So I have a couple pictures here to show you. We can stagger our plantings at different intervals. So we have added crop periods where we're harvesting. For those who have ever raised green beans, snap beans, and you plant them all of a sudden in one planting, you're going to have beans ready at one time. And when they're ready, you have to harvest. So maybe you want them staggered out a little bit. So we plant them based off your soil temperature and your timing, your frost date, but also, plant a set, maybe plant another set a week later and a week later after that. So that's called relaying. So you will have continuous production. If you are someone who wants to can, that might be something that maybe you want a second harvest, or if you want it all in one shot, plant it all in one shot. You can also mix and match a lot of your fast maturing short season crops together. So a lot of your leafy greens work well. A lot of your early things such as radishes, short season carrots, all of this is a great strategy to utilize some space. So we have a picture here on our bottom left of tomatoes in a Florida weave, and you have got some wonderful greens growing on the sides. So they're going to be growing, and as the tomatoes take off, that space is going to be taken up, of course. So you're going to harvest them out, but you're utilizing that space while they're maturing. So our bottom right picture is greens with broccoli next to it. So like Ian said, these brassicas will shade everything out really well as they mature, but we can get a jump on them with these cool season crops that like that cool soil, get them growing, that you can harvest them and you can get extra mileage out of that spot. You can also plant short, fast crops along with the slower crops. So maybe you have a longer developing crop, such as an indeterminate tomato. It takes a little while for it to take off, so you can utilize that space. Also, it helps create a little bit of a shade barrier around that plant. It helps some weed suppression there because there's no place for weeds to take up. So that's handy. And you can also make that part of your strategy with your irrigation system as well. So you can maximize the water use and reduce your water loss by pinpoint applicating your irrigation with drip lines or soaker hoses. So the plants are getting what you need and it's going into the soil and not up into the atmosphere. So you can do some different things here. And when we're talking at a high tunnel example with our lower left, we want to really make sure that we get as many crops grown that are quality and out of that space to help with the budget for the operation. And so if we're selling for markets, so that's a fun way to do this. So I wanted to show you these two pictures. Okay, so the next slide, please. We're going to talk about fall gardening a little bit because now is the time to be thinking about it. We will talk about fall gardening again, literally in the fall, but be thinking about what you want to do because July is about the time we'll sow a number of these crops. So something that I grew up with as a kid, we always planted what we called fall green beans, but we had to use several strategies. First, we needed to find our frost date, our average first frost date, where I lived in Northeast Kansas growing up. And we picked out a cultivar that wasn't terribly long in length. So, and we'd start counting the days backwards. So let's say October 15th is the average first frost date in North Platte, for instance. So October 14th is day one. And day two will be the 13th of October. And we're going to start counting backwards on the variety, on how long it's going to be to maturity. Then we're going to add 14 days for a harvest period. We're going to add another 14 days for what we call fall factor, because we're not going to be growing as fast in the fall. It's going to be a little cooler. Soils are going to cool down. The nighttime temperatures are going to cool down. So it's going to be a slower rate of growth. So we have to account for that. And then we're going to also add another 14 days if the crops are frost tender or not. So when we think of green beans, they're not going to manage a frost very well. So we should really add another 14 days. So when we're thinking about and we're counting back, especially those of us out west who have a shorter growing period for the year, we need to be thinking of shorter cultivars that are shorter in maturity and making sure that we have enough time to be able to harvest and justify that decision. So that really helps. There is the link to the fall gardening publication that we have for Extension. Dale Lindgren, our retired horticulturalist out at North Platte, and I wrote this several years ago, and it gives us a lot of great information on doing the planning side and thinking of all the considerations. You can also help extend the season by using floating row covers as extra time to keep them warm, but we can also use our floating row covers as a non-chemical barrier for a lot of our pest insects. So especially our brassicas that tend to be a real attractant to a lot of our not so fun pests that eat up the crops. So we can use floating row covers for an example that's really handy. Okay, the next slide, please. Here is the frost tender tolerance levels. So your semi-hardy vegetables that can tolerate that 32 degrees. So remember, we're talking about the temperature, and the duration of the temperature will tell us the severity of the damage. So if it dips down to 32 and then starts climbing back up, that's not going to be very, very hard. Now, remember, look at all the crops that are not on this list. Our melons, our beans, all of our Solanaceae family members, so our tomatoes, our peppers, our eggplants, our cucumbers, all of them, you get close to 32, they don't like it. So even a light frost will really severely damage them. But think about what we have here. We have beets, we have Chinese cabbage, collards, your bib, your lettuces, mustard, radishes, Swiss chard, onions. And also, when you think about fall gardening, the sugars develop at a higher level in the fall for fall gardening. So they tend to be sweeter produce wise. So fall gardening can be quite a delight. So it's something to be thinking about. So if you've got your timing down, you can stretch that garden to have a really nice fall garden as well. So we also can go down to the hardy vegetables that are hardy in a freeze. And we have actually tested this pretty hard in North Platte over the years, where we have unexpected cold snaps that can be very, very strong. And as you get into the sandhills and the panhandle, even more so. So we have had cabbage that has survived down to that 20 degrees because it's big, leafy, protected. It likes that cool, and it can withstand 20 degrees. Broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts are a long season crop. So it takes a while for those sprouts to develop on that stalk. So that's a good thing. Our carrots, our turnips, rutabagas, and kale. So what Ian was talking about, using our root crops to help break up a soil, you can use it also as a green manure. So maybe you don't care to eat turnips, but you can sow those as a fall crop to help amend your soil, to break up the soil, let them die and rot in the ground, and bring your good microbes into the soil. And of course, kale, how many times have we seen pictures of ornamental kale sitting out in a snowdrift? So that happens in late fall. It's perfect. So this is really a great way to integrate these in. I did not include this slide, but there are some families that are very good at bringing in beneficial insects. So our natural predators that Ian was talking about, the carrot family, the Apiaceae family, is one of the best on bringing in a lot of our parasitic wasps and fly species that are great at hunting down our bad guys. So think about that. And that can include dill and fennel, which we already grow for herb gardening. And so incorporating those herbs into, we have the biodiversity, we get the change, the difference in the foliage, you're getting the fresh herbs, but you're also bringing in an environment that attracts the good insects that can help us out in the garden. We can also bring in Queen Anne's lace, maybe plant it off to the side. And some people will really wrinkle their noses at Queen Anne's lace, but that is a really good one to attract the beneficial insects. Another family that is excellent for bringing in those is the aster family, which we think of the sunflowers. And Ian has a great picture of the sunflowers growing in his garden with his son. So that you have all kinds of choices in the aster family. You can bring in your beautiful bachelor buttons and all the cool stuff, the little bedding plants, but you can also bring in the sunflowers, and it's more of a holistic approach. And of course, your beans, your legumes. So that's fabulous with any of the peas and beans. Peas and beans work great in the fall. Also, your bee balm. You know, think about the greatness of bee balm in the flower garden as a border or in a planting, definitely helping out. Also, a great pollinator plant. So, if people would like this resource, I can share it later. But I thought those were some good families. Also, the Verbena family. So, if you like lantana or if you like the bedding plant Verbena, you can also tuck those guys in as a great option. And of course, as the fall comes in, the nighttime temperatures drop down, you'll see a flush of all of these plant family members, along with your vegetables, really take off again. And it's wonderful. Okay, next slide, please. This is from Crop Watch, and these are average first frost-free dates, or first frost dates here in our part of the in the whole state of Nebraska. And you can see that it varies quite a bit. So we have, especially in Lincoln County in southwest Nebraska, we're thinking September 21 to 30th. So we're always towards the end of the month, but we will see some anomalies on this map. So we have some later blips. There's that blip out in western Nebraska that is Keith and Perkins County. So they, for some reason, are a little warmer, and they have that little extra season on average. And this is years of data. So 1980 to 2010 is what they published. So you can see where our averages fall and where you live. So southeast Nebraska, of course, makes sense, is going to have a little longer growing season. Or if you're out in the far northern panhandle, it's going to be right around Labor Day time. So right about state fair time, expect a freeze out in the far northern panhandle. So this is a good reference. It's not absolute because each year is different. And heavens knows we've had lots of crazy weather in Nebraska. So never say never, and we'll get some surprises every once in a while. Okay, next slide, please. So when we talk about watering, this is really important, and it's going to vary whether you have an in-bed garden in the ground, whether you built a raised bed or whether you have a container. It all depends on your soil type and how water and irrigation moves through the profile of your garden, whether it be raised bed, whether it be a container bucket garden, or whether it's in the ground. Because sandy soil, your water moves more in a V-shaped form. So it's going to drain very easy. There's lots of pore space between the particles. And so there is less water and nutrient holding capacity in sandier soils, and it's going to move away fast. Versus our loam, which makes kind of a U shape, like a serving bowl. So think of the serving bowl kind of shape that will move around. And so it's going to move at a wider pattern, but it's going to go down and it's going to move slower. The last one, of course, is our clay. And in this picture here is the green on the very edge. And it's going to look like what the old dot matrix printer or a typewriter back and forth in a very long, shallow zigzag pattern, because there's very little pore space between the particles in clay soils or clay combination soils. So we have to be very careful because drainage is slow. Plants can root rot, or the moisture can be held hostage where clay, when it dries out, breaks in sharp angles. And so that's very important for us to think about the watering, your timing of your watering, and how fast water moves through your profile. So very, very important for us to remember. This is off of the WaterWise fruit and vegetable publication that Von Hammond and I authored several years ago. And there's the link for you to access it. But this is very important to know. Think of a V, think of a U, and then think of zigzag, 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 really, really slow. And that will help you on your soils. So after you irrigate, wait 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes. Take a long Phillips head screwdriver and shove that down in the ground where you watered. How far does it go down before you meet dry soil and resistance? And that will help you kind of gauge your watering strategy in the garden. And it's also saving water from runoff and running your soil and moving it away. So let's get that water down where it needs to go to the effective root zone of those crops. Okay, next, please. So irrigation considerations. Now, these are general terms. Like Ian said, not fast and certain, but we need to provide an evenly moist bed of moisture for those crops, especially for direct seeded crops. So they have a chance to get established where we get those first two leaves, true leaves that have emerged. So we will have our seedling come up. We will have the seed leaves, and then we will get the true leaves for each crop. The tip will help plant roots become established to start pulling the moisture and the nutrients for the growing season. So that's really important. Transplanted crops need to be watered to keep the roots and the leaves hydrated to avoid wilting during establishment. It's really good to use soaker and drip for several reasons, because that water is at the base of the plant. It's not kicking up on the foliage versus a spray that's spraying from the bottom up, or top head or overhead irrigation that's moving things around like Ian talked about. So it's getting the water at the base of the plant where it needs it. We're reducing our evaporation loss and getting it where it needs to go. So it's very important. And then the organic mulches, like Ian was talking, using organic mulches such as fresh straw or fresh hay that are pesticide free is very good. It helps cool the soil, keeps the soil moisture levels more moderated, reduces our evaporation, and helps keep the moisture available for roots to pull up. So it's very important. We see that little trick on Facebook where people are throwing Tums and acid in the bottom of the hole where you plant the tomato. It's because of a calcium tie-up. But the true test for blossom end rot on tomatoes especially, whether they're in the ground or in containers, and our peppers is that we need to keep even moisture levels available in the profile for those roots to absorb the calcium that's already present in the soil. Many Nebraska soils naturally have adequate calcium, so we don't have a problem. We see all these fad ideas, so be careful before you start trying them, or be careful before you just hit share on Facebook. And Scott just put up the Blossom End Rot publication. So watering in the morning is really good because feed is down, and it helps make sure that we have more evenly applied moisture, or in early evening. So after work, if you're working, get some moisture in before we do sets in. So we want to make sure we want everything done irrigating wise before we irrigate, before the dew sets in, because we do not want fungal diseases on accident when irrigating. Okay, next slide, please. Here's a neat little article from Michigan State Extension and a picture of a drip line where we have the drip line laid in a bed and the line is going down the middle. We also have half of that picture has some plastic mulch or biodegradable mulch. And so that is a weed control strategy as well as a moisture control strategy. And there are pros and cons to using that plastic. Penn State has done a fair amount of research related to plastic on commercial crops. So that's pretty interesting work. Some of our plastic mulches are now biodegradable and they can be purchased. They were first developed by the 3M company that makes their sticky notes, which are kind of cool. So we tested that out in our plot in North Platte and had success with it on weed control and keeping that bed evenly moist. It was a tomato study several years ago. Okay, next. Okay, so soaker and drip. We talked a lot about this already, and I don't want to run over time. Reduces the quantity of water that we need, reduces the waste from evaporation, gets the water at the base of the plant, and helps avoid overhead and the potential blight. Okay, next. So you can place soaker and drips under floating row covers and under plastic if you need. So that's very good. You can put these lines in raised beds. You can also set up drip in container gardens with the little spaghetti tubes and the emitters. You can also set up your timers and shut-off manifolds so you can very pinpoint your application. So that's also consideration. Next picture. This is one from North Carolina State Extension, of more of a permanent setting with a manifold system, and you can open up the valves. So I just wanted to show you that, and you can take a copy of that article as well, because I know we're running out of time. And then our questions. Any questions that you have, and here's our contact information.